We've explored the problem of externalities and some potential government interventions that can correct them. Now we'll shift to talk about what happens when we have a non-excludable good and how that results in market failure, as well as some solutions. So first, we have to define what we mean by non-excludable. Each good can be characterized by two variables, whether or not it's rival or whether or not it's excludable. And these aren't really binary. There's a spectrum. So it's not super clear cut where something falls. And in some situations, a product might be in one category, and in other situations, it might be in another category. But understanding these characteristics of the good helps us to understand how markets for that good function. So rivalry is referring to how we consume the product. So is the product diminished? Is the overall resource diminished with consumption? For example, if I eat a sandwich, there are fewer sandwiches, right? Two people can't just eat the same bite of sandwich, okay? So that's an example of a good that's rival, but not all goods are rival. So for example, if I'm listening to a song on the radio, you can also listen to the song on the radio. We can both listen to the same song, both derive utility from that. And it doesn't diminish the ability of anyone else to also listen to that song, right? So not all goods are rival in that they diminish the resource with consumption. Some goods are non-rival. Likewise, we want to consider the excludability of the resource, which refers to how easy it is to require people to pay, basically. Can we prevent people from consuming this product if they do not pay for it? And part of that has to do with the way that markets are set up, and part of that has to do with the type of product that we're talking about. So we have rivalry and excludability, and these two characteristics help us to understand how markets for different goods function. So for each box in this table, each combination of these two characteristics, we'll think about a different type of market. So excludable rival goods, which is what we're assuming when we talk about perfectly competitive markets, these are called private goods. And there's no problem with market failure here. The good is rival and excludable, then markets will function to get us to the socially optimal outcome. However, in these other situations, we have market failure. So if a good is excludable but non-rival, then we have a situation of natural monopoly or a club good. And we've talked about this already, right? What happens when we have a good that we charge for, but the marginal cost of provision is very low? That we're going to have a natural monopoly market, right? So we're thinking about things like Netflix, right? So it costs a lot to film a show on Netflix, but once you've produced the programming, the cost of allowing one more person to watch it is basically zero. It's non-rival, okay? So let's say some examples here too. So we can put Netflix here. And the market failure here comes from market power, right? Because it's a natural monopoly market, firms are likely to have market power, and they will restrict the quantity to raise their prices, and that leads to deadweight loss. For private goods, I'll just put a sandwich, and we don't necessarily expect any market failure there unless there are some externalities that we haven't taken into account. This is the column that we're going to focus on for the rest of this unit. So we want to think about what happens when products are non-excludable. So when we can't prevent people from consuming the product, then that really prevents the market from functioning, because here, if we can't charge people, right, it's difficult for a market to even provide this product. So we'll think about two different categories of goods here. If a good is non-excludable but rival, meaning the resource can be diminished then the good is not likely to be provided by a market at all. But we do think about goods in this category that are provided by nature in particular. So we have common property resources. So these are resources that can be depleted, but we can't prevent people from consuming them. They're open access. So we can think about fish. That's the classic, fish in the ocean. And the result is that we get overfishing. Okay. And then if we think about non-excludable, non-rival goods, these are what we call public goods. And these goods tend to be under-provided by the market. So here we get over-consumption. And here we get under-provision. So the supply will be lower than is socially optimal. Okay, and we'll explore why here in the next video. So an example of public good would be say fireworks. Okay, if I put on a fireworks show, then I can't prevent other people from seeing my beautiful fireworks, and they can enjoy that too. That can be a public good. But the private market will underprovide that good, which is one of the reasons why we tend to have governments, local governments, city governments providing municipal fireworks shows for big holidays like the 4th of July, because everybody can enjoy these beautiful fireworks. But privately, that product would be underprovided. Okay. So we're going to explore a little bit more about why we have market failure for these non-excludable goods, but it is important for you also to understand the definitions here and examples of goods in each of these categories. Okay, so for common property goods, we talked about this a little bit already, but for common property goods, the problem is that we have this open access resource. So the fact that the resource is open access leads to overconsumption. And in this situation, we call that the tragedy of the commons. And this is a commonly understood problem that arises when we have non-excludable rival resources. And we typically hear this problem in the context of environmental goods, but it can occur in other contexts as well. So what happens is that when I'm, say, take fish in the ocean, I'm going to go catch some fish. I think about how long it's going to take me to catch some fish, how much effort it will take me, how much that might cost in terms of equipment, etc., and whether or not the amount of fish that I get is worth it to me. What I don't take into account is the fact that when I catch fish, it depletes the fish stock and it causes other people to have to spend a longer time trying to catch fish, right? If there's a lot of fish, it's easy to catch them. If there's not very many fish, it's hard to catch them. So as I consume the fish and I deplete part of the resource, the cost of that, part of the cost is borne not just by me, but by everyone, in the sense that there are now fewer fish and it's harder to catch them. So individuals don't take into account the cost in terms of resource depletion of their consumption. So individuals don't take into account the cost of consumption in terms of resource depletion. So there's an external cost to society that I'm not taking into account when I decide how many fish to catch, and therefore I catch too many fish. Everybody does. And so that resource becomes depleted, right? We have overfishing, we have deforestation, and that is bad for everyone. So this can become a quite extreme problem, resulting even in environmental collapse. So the solution here, we can see clearly if we think about what the problem really is. The problem is that good is non-excludable. The problem is that we can't prevent people from consuming it. People don't pay for this product. They don't pay for access to the product. It's open access. And so they don't take into account the real cost of their actions in terms of access and resource depletion. So the solution then is to try to enforce some kind of excludability, to try to force people to take that into account when they make their individual consumption decisions. And so the solution really is to firm up property rights, right? To say who has the right to catch fish, or who has the right to catch this many fish, right? So the solution here is to establish more clear property rights systems to address the non-excludability problem. Now, that can be achieved in a variety of ways. We can have shared governance, where everybody who might depend on the resource gets together and together decides how much of that resource will be consumed in any amount of time, or who might be able to access the resource when, right? So we can together fix this problem without necessarily formal government intervention, but as the problem, as the common property good problem gets larger, then we again begin to need government intervention in order to solve the problem. So an example like of a easily solvable shared governance common property good problem would be if you share hot water with the rest of your family, and you have you don't have a tankless hot water heater, right? Then the hot water runs out. The hot water in the morning runs out, and then whoever's last has a cold shower, right? And so these problems are avoided by just talking to each other. We can manage this hot water resource effectively that way. But as the problems get bigger, if we're talking about deforestation, global warming, overfishing in our oceans, then we need governments to step in. Okay, so another solution is to establish private ownership over the resource. If people own the resource, they have an incentive to protect it. And there have been some examples of that in terms of wildlife protection in sub-Saharan Africa. Some countries have given people the right to kill elephants as long as they're on their land, in an attempt to protect the elephants from poachers. And that's quite interesting and controversial, but this is the idea here. And then the last option that I want to mention here is similar to a cap and trade type system, where we have individual tradable quotas. So we limit the total amount that can be consumed, but then we allow people to trade permits for resource extraction. And this has been implemented primarily in fisheries, which, and it has been somewhat successful at controlling overfishing, but also creating good incentives for fishermen to work together and not have a really dangerous time trying to catch fish. Okay, so I know we've done a very quick overview of this. I mostly want to just introduce you to the concept of the tragedy of the commons, so that you understand the underlying economic problem and some of the solutions. We're going to move on in the next video to do a more thorough example of a problem with public goods.